We're off on the history trail in 1 minute on the roads and waterways.
Well, this isn't much of a road, is it? At least not by our standards. But 300 years ago, it was one of the better roads in England. This was a major crossroads. That road came from Cambridge and went east. This road came from London and went northwards towards Newmarket and Norwich. If you were farming here 300 years ago and you wanted to send your barley to London, it would have to be sent down one of these roads, on horseback. A grass track is not a good road for a heavy wagon. But how else could you move crops, timber, furniture and pottery? The wheels cut into the ground, and you needed 6 or even 10 horses to pull the wagon along. And as well as a wagon driver, you also needed people to walk ahead with the horses, guiding them over the ground. This track's very good, firm and not deeply rutted. But sometimes there were cart ruts more than ½ a metre deep, baked hard by the sun. And in bad weather, there were even worse problems. One solution was not to use a wagon, just load bags onto ponies and lead a pack train across the country. But you needed 1 handler for every 2 ponies, and the ponies couldn't carry very much. Even better were mules or donkeys, because they were more sure-footed. Pack trains were the regular way of moving all sorts of goods like this. These donkeys are carrying coal. It was a very slow and expensive way of moving goods, so a coal fire was a luxury. But the wagons did get through in the end. You just had to lighten the load in the difficult places, which is one reason why you needed 2 handlers. Of course, a few things would get damaged on the journey.
Forward! Forward! Come on.
300 years ago, one of the main roads in East Anglia was the road from Norwich. It was 115 miles long, and it went through Newmarket to London. But the road was so bad that people preferred to take their heavy goods to the coast and then send them by sea to London instead, even if that meant starting the journey by going north, to a port like Kings Lynn, for example, instead of south. One of the main centres in East Anglia for moving things like coal, wine and grain between the countryside and the coast was a village just outside Newmarket. And they brought the grain here, Commercial End. Now we're going to meet John Walter. He's a historian, and he's been helping us behind the scenes throughout the series. Hello, John.
Hello.
Tell me, why did they bring the grain up here?
Well, it's difficult to believe it now, but Commercial End in the 18th century was an important port.
How? I mean, there's no sea here.
No, we're 40 miles from the sea here, but barges in the 18th century came all that way to here, by river. Rivers were the motorways of 18th century England. We've seen the roads, and we've seen how bad they could be. And when it came to moving heavy goods, like grain, it was easier and quicker and cheaper to move it by water. Horses, by themselves, could carry very little, perhaps 150 kilos. If we had a team of horses and a good road, they could carry perhaps 2 tons. But a single horse could pull a barge carrying as much as 25 tons.
Come on.
You see down here, the waterway where the barges came, 15 metres long. And that's the wharf where they would have unloaded their goods and where the grain brought by road to Commercial End would have been put back on the barges to be taken down to Kings Lynn.
But how did the barges get up here? I mean, it doesn't look deep enough.
It doesn't, does it?
No.
Well, it was deeper then, but not that deep. The barges were specially built and they didn't need very much water.
This was originally an old Roman canal, Lorain. From about 1750, new canals were cut so that goods could be moved to other towns as easily as here to Commercial End.
Whose house is this?
This is the house of the merchant who organised the trade from Commercial End.
It's very beautiful, isn't it?
Yes. And this is the counting house. This is where the merchant would have counted his money.
What's that, though?
And that's where he would have kept his money. That's the safe.
And that one too?
Yes.
Underneath?
Come and look at this. Look at the side of the fireplace. See where it's been worn away. That's where the clerks sharpen their knives to cut their quill pens. And some of the goods the merchant traded in were very valuable, and the most valuable was wine. And this is where they hid it, but there's nothing in there now. We're in a Cambridgeshire village, 40 miles from the sea. But look, somebody has carved a big ship on the wall. Here are the portholes, and here are the masts. We don't know who carved it, or when, or why. But we do know that this village was linked directly to the sea. Boats went regularly from here, by water, to Kings Lynn. When the grain got to Lynn, they could then transfer the grain from the barges onto larger boats, And those boats could then take that grain, perhaps to the northeast of England, to London, even across to the Netherlands.
So the people in the 18th century used the sea for transport far more than we do now.
Yes.
The old customs house of Kings Lynn is still standing next to the quay. This is where barges from the countryside were unloaded into large seagoing boats and collected coal, wine and timber for the journey back. And the merchants of Kings Lynn, like this chap who built the customs house, prospered, grew rich and built fine houses. But round the back of the merchants' houses, things look a bit different. We can see that the house has behind it warehouses that run all the way down to the quay.
Ah.
And that made it easy for the merchants to take the goods off the ships, the coal and the grain, and to bring them straight into their yards and warehouses.
But the river's 50 metres away. I mean, how did they get the grain into the warehouses?
Well, if we'd been standing here in the 18th century, Lorraine, our boots would be very wet.
Why?
Well, because in those days the river came right up to the warehouse, and so the merchants could have taken their goods straight off the boats and straight into their warehouses.
So the river's moved since the 18th century?
Yes, Lorraine.
That building looks very tumble down, doesn't it?
It does, doesn't it, Lorraine? Nobody looking at that building would have guessed that Lynn was one of the most important ports in the 18th century, and that warehouses like that would have stored the coal that made Lynn so prosperous.
But why Kings Lynn? Why was it such an important port?
Well, you have the River Ouse, and if we were to trace the River Ouse back on a map, we could see that it spreads its tentacles into perhaps 10 counties, and that in the 18th century, all of those counties would send their grain, like from Commercial End, out via Lynn, and in its turn, Lynn would bring coal and wine and other goods, perhaps oranges and spices, to here, to be put back into the barges and taken back down those rivers to those same towns and villages.
So this really was a very important port.
It was an important port, but when the railways came, Lynn lost its importance, and anybody looking at it now would have no idea that it had been so important.
What's that?
Well, carts would have come down here to load at the quay, and those were to stop the cart wheels from knocking the walls down.
How very clever. Carts had a hard time getting to Kings Lynn, but around 1750 the roads began to improve. The posts in the gate block the entrance to a new road out of London. The gate was called a turnpike. There's a gatekeeper. People had to pay to pass him because the road was specially built by a private company. Turnpike roads were a great improvement. A turnpike surface would probably be made with small loose stones. It was a tremendous improvement on the old trackways. On the old roads, you might go 30 miles in a day. Now you could go 60. People began to travel much more in light, well-sprung vehicles like this one, called a phaeton. This was the family car, if you like, of the turnpike age. John Parker.
Well, this one is a demi-mail phaeton, and it was a gentleman's carriage. In families in those days, you had father who had, shall we say, the equivalent to the modern motor car, which was a big carriage. You had the son with his little sports car, which would be a light, fast carriage. This was the in-between, halfway between one and the other. It was used for mother and father to go to dinners, racing, anything.
And what were the roads like that this would run on?
Very much like here, dirt and small pebble road, puddles.
Carriages like John Parker's phaeton ran happily along these new turnpike roads, but they still had to cope with mud tracks as well. Hello, John. What was it like travelling on the roads in those days?
Very hard.
Why?
Well, you've got to think back. I mean, you're not dealing with roads like now. You're dealing with tracks. You're dealing with holes that might not be there today and will be there tomorrow. I mean, one prime thing, people used to want stone for the garden and earth, and they used to go and take it off a road.
So they'd have great potholes?
Right, great big holes, yeah.
That would just appear overnight?
That's right, and then when the winter came, it became mud. People would then go round the mud and the road got wider. And then suddenly, come the summer, rock hard, there'd be a big hole and ruts that just like concrete.
And these were inferior roads. I mean, were the turnpike roads in better condition?
Well, they were better condition at the end of 1700s, not early on.
Not early on?
No.
And when would this carriage have been used?
This would have been used in the late 1700s.
I see.
And it's built for bad roads. I mean, it's got wooden wheels, an iron tyre, as they didn't have rubber as such. It had an iron tyre. It's got very strong springs. The springing, fantastic springing.
Good suspension?
Oh, yeah. And it's built to cope with going down 6-inch holes and bouncing back out without shaking the owner, shall we say, out the back.
Why do you have a lamp on this carriage?
Well, to be seen with it, you've got to remember that there weren't street lights. See, the average speed of this was something like 6 miles an hour at night. Now, with another one coming the other way at 6 miles an hour at night, if they collide, you've got quite a bang. So the lamp was mainly to let somebody else see that you were coming. Now, the only things that went at night were fools, usually, or the mail coaches, yeah. The mail coach, he ran at night, and he wouldn't stop. I mean, if you're in the road and you were killed, you're in the way of the Royal Mail, and that's it.
The mail coach wasn't the only thing to race round East Anglia. Then, as now, there were racehorses, and crowds who travelled to see them. Newmarket Racecourse is about 60 miles from London. A day out at the races has been a popular holiday for Londoners for about 250 years. This is how people used to get to Newmarket in the old days. The route went across Newmarket Heath. The heath is broad and flat, but there's one big obstacle. To get to the racecourse, people had to get past this, the Devil's Dyke. It's a great wall about 8 miles long and was built well over 1,000 years ago. But there were gaps in the dike about 400 metres apart, and people could choose which gaps to use. But in 1757 the route changed. A turnpike road was built. The new road cut through the dike. The modern road is right where they made the turnpike, and that was the old toll house. So, to force everyone to come through the toll gate, the other gaps in the wall were blocked up. To get into or out of Newmarket, you had to pay at the toll gate. But of course, people who came to the races were not at all happy about that, especially if they'd lost a lot of money backing the wrong horses. Having to pay to travel on the roads annoyed a lot of people. In some places, they rioted and destroyed the turnpike gates. But in Newmarket, there was no need for a riot. The Jockey Club, which organises racing at Newmarket, is a very rich club with very powerful members, and they were able to force the Turnpike Company to think again. So, the gaps in the dike were opened up again, but only on race days.
row Wyatt, the wife of the chairman of the horse race totalisator board.
Our last programme this afternoon for schools and colleges takes us to the Music Arcade for music and dance. That's here on BBC One in 2.5 minutes.